spent taking their families on a trip to their native France every year or so. Trees started promoting, writing letters to firms and organizations, advertising in magazines, starting the Society of Medallists, and funding this film. Laura Fraser continues the creative process by adding lettering to her model. She has made the model for the reverse by the same method as the obverse. Here the sculptor has modeled most of the lettering on the reverse. Only 2 letters remain to be completed. Lettering is often the most tedious part of modeling. She rolls thin ropes of clay to be applied to her model to form the letters. Laura Fraser has chosen this technique to form the ideal rounded stems and curves of the letter forms. They will not have any undercuts if applied firmly to the clay background. Other techniques for modeling letters include carving each letter, or making a negative cast of letters needed, and applying the positive cast in clay or plaster. Custom then dictated that lettering always appear in capital letters, although Paul Manship once did a medal with caps and small caps on one side and caps and lowercase on the reverse. The letter forms may be any typeface or style, with or without serifs, whatever the designer chooses. The lettering should be in harmony with the theme of the medal, as the type styles can have symbolic meaning as well. The studio assistant prepares the plaster casting. A long strip of galvanized iron or other metal 3 or 4 inches wide forms a circular fence around the clay model. It is held tight as the weight of the plaster could distort it during pouring. A fairly thin mixture of plaster and water is spatulated, that is, stirred beneath the surface not to introduce air into the mixture. Each minute of spatulation reduces the curing time by 1 or 2 minutes. It is first brushed into all crevices of the pattern, worked around into all parts of the design to eliminate air bubbles. Should bubbles appear, the caster blows on them until they disappear. The remainder of the plaster is poured until 1 inch to 1.5 inches thickness is formed. After 30 or 40 minutes, the plaster cast is hard. It gives off heat as it hardens. When it is cool to the touch, it can be separated by running a dull knife around between mold and cast. It can then be pried apart, but it must be lifted straight up not to harm the delicate edges of the relief. Once removed, the cast needs to be touched up. Sometimes air is trapped in the mold near the rise of the relief and forms voids in the casting. Thus, the edges of device and lettering are closely examined and repaired where necessary. The cast is separated with greater ease if the mold is first coated with a release agent. It is not shown here, but the trick of the trade at the time, and still used by sculptors today, was to lightly dust talc on a clay surface. For plaster, vegetable oil can be sprayed on, or after World War II, silicone spray is commonly used. Laura Fraser touches up the positive plaster cast again, near the relief or lettering where casting flaws may occur. Working in the positive is somewhat easier because the final image, though larger in size, is constantly in front of the artist. Crisp detail is defined and sharpened. The reverse is cast in the same manner as the obverse shown earlier. The reverse pattern is cast from the original clay. This negative model is made from that first plaster casting. It was necessary that the release agent be as thin as possible. A diluted vegetable oil is sprayed on the mold evenly before pouring the plaster. The positive reverse is cast from the negative mold. Each of these has to be examined by the sculptor, who removes casting imperfections, bubble voids, and sharpens up all edges and detail. The positive plaster casts, made in the artist's studio, when in perfect state, are taken to the bronze foundry. This is Roman bronze in New York City. The caster closely examines Fraser's final plaster, now serving as a pattern for a hard metal bronze casting. He places a pattern on a bed of green sand, relief side up, within the mold frame, called a drag. A cope is placed over the drag to contain the sand, to form the mold from which the bronze will be cast. Fine sand is sifted over the pattern, and green sand is shoveled over this. Then the caster packs the green sand with his fingers and a bench rammer. Laura Fraser has chosen this old technique to make the metal patterns for the two sides of the medal. She chose to have foundry casts made instead of having galvanos made by electroformed casting. The caster will now prepare a mold with a core in which to cast the pattern. The core material must be removed to form the thickness of the bronze casting. It is chipped away and discarded. This area will form the body of the casting. Because it was made as a foundry cast, the final metal pattern will impart to the final medal somewhat of a more sculptural look, ideal for a Sculpture Award medal. Foundry workers pour the molten bronze metal after gates and sprues were formed in the mold to allow the metal to enter the mold and the air to escape. The pour is done with a two-man crucible. Metal casting is one of man's oldest techniques, yet experience is necessary at every step of the process. Knowledge of metal composition, furnace temperature, metal flow, and a dozen other variables, all are required to make a successful cast. Even so, faulty castings can occur. After cooling, the bronze casting is removed from the mold. The sand sticking to the casting is easily removed by a tap to the edge and by wire brushing. The result is a perfect bronze cast, the exact replica of Laura Fraser's three-dimensional bas-relief design in hard metal form. The models for both sides of the medal are now complete. Next, the dies are made from these patterns. Before we see how dies are made, I will relate what happened when this film was first shown to a large group of sculptors. Because of the Depression in the mid-1930s, the showing was delayed. Often at this terrible time in American history, the employees at Medallic Art Company worked only half days. There just was not enough demand for medallic work. It was not until spring 1937 that Clyde Trees decided to polish his company's image and give a sit-down dinner, to which he invited the members of the National Sculpture Society. The highlight of the event was to be the showing of this film, The Medal Maker. He hired a caterer and a photographer. He ordered a St. Gaudens medal struck as a party favor. This Hansen plaquette with the inscription on the reverse, Sculptor's Dinner of the Medallic Art Company, April 9, 1937, was given to every person who attended. He had sent out invitations hoping 24 people would attend. Instead, 75 people accepted the invitation, severely straining the facilities of the tiny shop. Presses were shoved aside, machines pushed into a corner. Tables were set up on the first floor of the cramped premises at 210 East 51st Street in Midtown Manhattan. They shoehorned everyone into the crowded offices on the second floor and showed this film before the dinner was served downstairs to those prominent practitioners of their art